Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So this week, I wanted to talk about the new White House National Security Strategy. On March 2nd, just a few weeks ago, the Biden-Harris administration announced a new national cybersecurity strategy. And I think it's really important that we stay up on these sorts of things because the federal government is a huge pusher or, influencer in policy, as well as really where organizations may start to move to. So if they drive their federal agencies to do something, that has a trickle-down effect. So if you haven't read through it, that's okay. We're going to give you the 50,000-foot overview of it, but links will be in the show notes for the official executive briefing as well as the full strategy document. So in the strategy, they said that we as the United States must make fundamental shifts in how we allocate roles, responsibilities, and resources in cyberspace. And to do that, they said we must first rebalance the responsibility to defend cyberspace by shifting the burden for cybersecurity away from individuals, small businesses, and local governments and onto the organizations that are most capable and best positioned to reduce risks for us all. I thought that was super interesting. That is one of the, summary statements that we'll kind of touch on for this entire strategy, which goes into collaboration. There's a lot of talk about collaboration. The second thing that they talked about in there was realigning incentives to favor long-term investments by striking a careful balance between defending ourselves against urgent threats today and simultaneously strategically planning for and investing in a resilient future. And that also is, again, a very good summary statement for a lot of the details that they highlight throughout the entire strategy.
We're blasting out of the gate here with some really interesting statements. I find, and by the way, just dear listener, a lot of this is my first time being exposed to this. So you're getting my live reaction as we go through it. For that first item about rebalancing the responsibility and shifting that burden away from, and specifically called out, individuals, small businesses, and local governments. That's interesting because honestly, they've been the worst positioned to handle the threats that exist in our world today. You think of a lot of local governments, schools in particular, have been hit. Think of small business. They just don't have the resources to staff up like a whole SOC and a whole security team. And you think of individuals, people in your day-to-day lives. I'm sure all of us as listeners and viewers of this show do our best to help those around us, but it's an evolving and ever-evolving fight. And it's honestly hard. You don't want to nag your parents or your grandparents. Make sure you're doing this, make sure you're doing that all of the time. And so this idea of shifting the burden onto organizations that are most capable and best positioned is interesting. I think of several weeks ago now, we did a show, and I forget what the topic was, but I know an item came up where we were talking about some of Microsoft's identity capabilities. And there was this comparison that for managed identities, like the consumer accounts you use for Xbox and for personal Microsoft 365 and Skype, those are almost an order of magnitude less likely to be attacked than the ones managed by enterprises and businesses. And that's because Microsoft is better positioned to know what to do and to how to secure those identities. And so that's already, I'm not patting myself on the back here, but that gives an example of what we're talking about, where these companies that have the resources have almost a responsibility to deliver security and meaningful security by default. I'll give credit to Apple as an example. One thing Apple has done very quietly has gated all of the best features of their ecosystem behind two-factor authentication. If you don't have two-factor authentication turned on for your Apple ID, there's a whole lot of features you cannot use and cannot take advantage of. So Apple's using the carrot instead of the stick to get you there. And more of that, please. That's exactly the sort of thing we need. And maybe we need less of Twitter pulling the rug out from underneath people and taking a two-factor authentication method away from them. But that's another subject for another time. I just find that really interesting, and I see already examples of that happening, and I want more of that. The second item around realigning incentives, I'm curious what incentives they're talking about, and maybe that will be revealed as we go along.
Yes, we will talk about a little bit of that.
Okay, perfect.
So in the strategy, it outlines 5 pillars on how essentially the federal government is recommending that we move forward as a nation, as an organization, and then how we're going to try to achieve these objectives. The first one is to defend critical infrastructure. And the Biden-Harris administration wants to give the American people confidence in the availability and resilience of the critical infrastructure and the essential services it provides by, number one, expanding the use of minimum cybersecurity requirements in critical sectors to ensure national security and public safety, and harmonizing regulations to reduce burden of compliance. The second point is enabling public-private collaboration, and that's really led by the organization CISA, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but they want to enable that collaboration at the speed and scale necessary to defend critical infrastructure and essential services. And then finally, defending and modernizing federal networks and updating federal incident response policy. Now, CISA has been around for a little while, and if you don't know, there are now, I think, at least one, what we call state CISOs, that are the CISA representatives per the states, and they have a lot of resources. So I urge you to look on your state website, on the CISA website, find out who your state CISO is. They provide free consultation services, training. There's a lot of things you can sign up for. And they're kind of the spear, the tip of the spear that is leading this public-private collaboration. But that is really, I think, a shift where normally the government hasn't really been too involved or really done a ton of collaboration with private companies. And this is where they realize that cybersecurity is like a team sport and we need to play together, even if we're a private company and you're the public sector.
The sentence there that caught my ear was harmonizing regulations to reduce the burden of compliance. And I was out having cocktails with some former colleagues yesterday, and somehow the subject got to password rotation. And I mentioned to them that Microsoft has not recommended password rotation since 2016 when our current password guidance came out. But here's the thing, that took time to trickle down even inside of Microsoft. So you think of like security baselines that ship that you can apply against both server as well as workstation operating systems. And for several years after we published that guidance, there were still security baselines like group policies that would enforce password rotation. So even inside of Microsoft, there was not harmonization of that as an example. And to this day, even though we're now 7 years past the publication of that really landmark document, you still have various regulatory bodies and audits that still check for and require password rotation. So even if you're a very modern, forward-thinking CISO, you may have industry regulation that you have to comply with that says, nope, you still need to rotate passwords. Even though we know today there's more problem with that than security benefit. And I think that's just one example. And so this effort to harmonize regulation could take inspiration from things like that, because NIST guidelines have been updated as well to not require password rotation. And so if that could be applied more broadly, and I'm picking on one specific example, but I think it's one that's resonant for everyone because we all hate changing passwords. That's an example where you have companies today that regulatory burden is preventing them from being more secure. And so that's an example of what this pillar is trying to fix. And again, I know this is focused on critical infrastructure, but can be applied more broadly as well. I think the rest of it, to your point, Andy, is relatively new in terms of public-private collaboration. I know for me, I've seen and heard more CISOs that I interact with quoting and referencing CISA guidance than ever before. I mean, really in the past, I'd say since Chris Krebs used to sit in that role as leading that team, that was really kind of the shifting point to where there was a lot more collaboration. And I see that only growing moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. The second pillar is disrupt and dismantle threat actors. And this also really piqued my interest because, this strategy talks about using all instruments of national power. We will make malicious cyber actors incapable of threatening the national security or public safety of the United States, including by strategically employing all tools of national power to disrupt adversaries, engaging the private sector in disruption activities through scalable mechanisms, and addressing the ransomware threat through a comprehensive federal approach in lockstep with our international partners. Now, again, that is, to me, huge, where the federal government is engaging with the private sector to employ essentially offensive tools. And if you don't know, we have many military branches have cybersecurity units, and they, of course, do defensive things, but they also do offensive capabilities. And so if you want to essentially legally hack a nation state, sign up for the military. You will have the authorization to conduct cyber war. It's a real thing now. So this here in this cyber strategy basically tells me, like, we're going to continue to do that. Maybe it's not through technology. Maybe, some of it is the kinetic war to disrupt their cybersecurity infrastructure or capabilities, but for sure we're going to have digital ones as well. And, the Ukraine-Russian war is a very real example of how cybersecurity was part of the kinetic war as well. So this was have this laid out and said, kind of on paper is, to me, a very forward thinking.
It uses really big language, employing all tools of national power to disrupt adversaries. That's a big language. Obviously, this is a little short on detail, but the concept is, as opposed to this being a battle that private sector is going to fight alone, we are going to leverage the power of the United States of America to disrupt these adversaries, which is kind of a key shift in strategic thinking moving forward. And I think of a couple of thoughts here as well. Number one, you go all the way back to Prohibition era. Al Capone ultimately was, charged with tax evasion, is how they effectively got him, so to speak. And one of the very first trips I got to make right when I joined Microsoft, I got to go to an executive briefing. And we did our typical trip to the Cyber Defense Operations Center, which I'd never seen before. But the other trip, and even as a technologist, I didn't know this existed, was we went and visited the Microsoft Digital Crimes Unit. And the Digital Crimes Unit is responsible for disrupting a lot of different malicious actors, not just like ransomware gangs or organizations that intend to hack, but also, for example, ones that peddle in like CSAM, child sexual abuse material. And they use very novel methods, like legal methods, to disrupt these bad actors in terms of like taking over their DNS records or other things like that approach to disrupt their activities. And it was really interesting how they actually work a lot with the legal system and the judicial system in order to disrupt these adversaries. And so when I saw in lockstep with our international partners in this pillar, I thought of how can we do things like extradition, international treaties, international law, Interpol, to potentially disrupt these adversaries as well. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're disrupting, you're going to go arrest them for hacking, but you might, again, work with like an international registrar to change all their DNS records or something. And it's going to make all their stuff not work and break. That's an example of something you could do. Or get them on something else, like the equivalent of tax evasion. So this is just interesting to me. I see this as almost very direct, like you were talking about, Andy, where empowering our military to be almost offensive in stopping this. But I also see this as leveraging any and all international cooperation to disrupt these gangs as well. And that's really interesting. Again, something that our employer was doing in the private sector. Literally, my visit was in early 2017, and they'd been at it for a while, and kind of progressing from there. So this is nice, again, to see more government interaction in this to help the private sector in what they were already trying to do to disrupt these threat actors.
The third pillar is shape market forces to drive security and resilience. And I really am piqued by the language that they're using here. They want to place responsibility on those within our digital ecosystem that are best positioned to reduce risk and shift consequences of poor security away from the most vulnerable in order to make our digital ecosystem more trustworthy by, number one, including privacy and security of personal data, shifting liability for software products and services to promote secure development practices, and then finally, ensuring that federal grant programs promote investment in new infrastructure that are secure and resilient. Now that, when I saw that, I was like, oh, are there going to be federal grants to maybe small businesses or even larger organizations to help fund more resilient cybersecurity infrastructure? Because that would be kind of cool. I don't know how I feel just in general about our tax dollars going towards that, but maybe if it's for the greater good, and, you know, Adam, you always say a rising tide raises all ships or something like that.
Exactly right.
I mean, that may help. So having the federal government provide, you know, resources and especially monetary help to organizations that may be struggling, and it may not just be funding infrastructure, it could be people too, you know, just training or, you know, helping fund different programs there. So I thought that was really interesting. You know, it talked about in the beginning, those incentives. I think this is probably one of them that they're talking about.
This is, again, another very interesting pillar, talking about shaping market forces. That's a really interesting play, and I can understand some of the discomfort with that. And again, there's more detail to come on the exact methods through which this will happen. However, some of the concepts, again, are interesting, like promoting privacy and security of personal data. Okay. Obviously, there are some organizations that value that more than others. How would that work out where, you know, Apple and Microsoft tend to have stronger protections for personal data than, say, Google and Amazon? So that's just one example that I'm curious to learn more about. Shifting liability to encourage secure software development practices. Wow. What does that mean? If you release insecure code, can you be liable for damages of the people who were running your software? Maybe. That's interesting. The federal grants one, I think, is actually less interesting, actually, because if you think of like already and has for a very long time, the federal government gives grants to do like a lot of medical research. A lot of medical research is federally funded, as an example. And you think of some of the departments the federal government funds, like, for example, the National Weather Service. And the National Weather Service reason to exist is to protect life and property, to give you that advance notification of it's going to be dangerous weather. Here are the steps you can take to protect yourself, so you have that advance notice. Whether that's a hurricane or a thunderstorm or a snowstorm, that's the purpose of the National Weather Service to exist. So I don't think it's a big leap then if we've invested in things like prolonging life, protecting property. This is the same sort of thing. I mean, ultimately, we're getting to the point when cybersecurity risks do threaten life and property. We've talked about them breaking into companies responsible for municipal water supply and potentially changing the mix of the chemicals that are mixed into that, where it could have been dangerous. You think of disabling or tampering with alarm systems, HVAC systems. To me, protecting that is really no different than kind of what the role like the National Weather Service plays, as an example, to, again, protect those same sorts of things, just from a different threat. So to me, that makes logical sense. And maybe, if anything, it's surprising we haven't done it already. Why have we funded medical research all along, but not funded more research and development into more secure infrastructure? So I think that's cool. I think that's a great idea. Maybe almost overdue at this point, but still a positive step forward.
The fourth pillar is invest in a resilient future. And so the Biden-Harris administration wants to invest in this future by, having strategic investments, coordinated and collaborative actions, leading the world in innovation of secure and resilient next generation technologies. So they want to reduce, and this I thought was interesting because I don't know, like you said, Adam, there's not a lot of detail. So I would be curious to hear more. And maybe there is more in the actual policy, which was very long. I didn't have time to read through the whole thing, but they want to reduce systematic technical vulnerabilities in the foundation of the internet, which, of course, we all know that the internet wasn't really designed to be used in the way it is today. It evolved into that. And of course, there are fundamental things that are inherently insecure in the way that we've done things, just because it was never meant to be scaled into the World Wide Web as we know it today. So they want to reduce the vulnerabilities that are there, and then prioritize cybersecurity R&D for next generation technologies such as post-quantum encryption, digital identity solutions, and a clean energy infrastructure. And then finally, develop a diverse and robust national cyber workforce. So all really good stuff. We've talked about the post-quantum encryption. I'm glad that the federal government's, getting in there to, fund these type of R&D, technologies. And then it'd be great to have some sort of pipeline to develop more, cybersecurity practitioners. So hopefully that's all in the works here, sounds like.
This makes me smile because we've talked about almost every one of these subjects on this show. So it makes me feel like, wow, we're on the pulse of a lot of these things that need to happen. Nothing more to say about a diverse and robust national cyber workforce. We've been on that over and over, that we need diversity in that field and we need more people in that field overall. Nothing else to say. Interesting about post-quantum encryption. I think that is a threat to national security. Ultimately, when that breakthrough comes, we need to be prepared for it and we need to know what comes next. And we did a show on that already. So that's interesting. Reducing systemic technical vulnerabilities in the foundation of the internet. Log4j, anyone? And we had the gal who wrote the book on application security, Tanya Jenka, was actually our first ever video guest on the show when we started doing video. And one of the things she talked about in her book and during our interview with her was that there's this false perception that open source software is inherently more secure, because there's this idea that, well, if the source code is open, obviously some cyber review fairy is going around GitHub repositories and reviewing code for vulnerabilities. And that's not really true. Like, nobody's just doing that for kicks. In fact, we've kind of talked about that if you're a cybersecurity researcher, you're going to tend to go to who pays you money, like the Microsofts and Apples of the world and many other large vendors, Google, who will pay you if you discover flaws in their software, quite handsomely, in fact, if you can, make a run of it. And open source software, in a lot of cases, doesn't offer that same incentive process. And so that's a real problem, because so much of the internet is built upon open source libraries. I mean, there's lots of good things about open source. I'm not knocking it, but at the same time, like, you think of just Log4j, this Apache logging component that was baked into so much software across the internet. I mean, Minecraft servers, Twitter, like, it was everywhere. And nobody's really done a security review it. I mean, kind of bonkers when you get down to it. So I see that as what they're talking about here, and where there's more work to do, because ultimately I feel like we didn't really fix anything from Log4j. We dealt with that tactically instead of strategically. And there's more work to do. I think we're trying to do a better job with things like GitHub Advanced Security of having an inventory of what libraries are linked into our code and what their status is. So we have that library inventory for our company, and we can take steps if we learn that a library is at risk. However, I think overall there's still a tremendous amount of threat there. And I think we really didn't learn any lessons from that. I think we just cleaned it up the best that we could and moved on, because it's such a big problem. It's so massive. Like, it's going to be really, really hard to resolve. And it's going to take a lot of concerted effort over a pretty significant period of time, because we've built so many dependencies on top of these open source libraries, and we're kind of beholden to them at this point. And ripping them all out would be really difficult. And for the most part, they're all really good. They're really tight code. They're really efficient. So there's no impetus to do it. But at the same time, I think a lot of them, if we discover some sort of vulnerability in them, we're going to be back to where we were when Log4j was all we were talking about for a while.
I think you're spot on in your response on that. Definitely. The final pillar is forging international partnerships to pursue shared goals. And Adam, you kind of alluded to some of this, where, we're working with the international community, different organizations there. But laid out in this last pillar is, the Biden-Harris administration wants the United States to seek a world where responsible state behavior in cybersecurity is expected and reinforced, and where irresponsible behavior is isolating and costly. And that is, I think it's a really good statement there, because it's kind of like, almost like the Geneva Convention, like, this is how we should responsibly fight wars, right? Like, this is cyberspace. This is how you are supposed to treat this space. And any type of behavior is, isolating and costly. So they want to do that with a couple of points here. Number one, leveraging international coalitions and partnerships among like-minded nations to counter threats in our digital ecosystem through joint preparedness, response, and cost imposition. Two, increasing the capacity of our partners to defend themselves against cyber threats, both in peacetime and in crisis. And then finally, working with our allies and partners to make secure, reliable, trustworthy global supply chains for information and communications technology and operational technology products and services. So I think this is great. I as far as a holistic document and a strategy, I think this is spot on. There's really, it's hits all the points in my opinion.
This last one, I grabbed onto the same things you did. In particular, that statement about responsible state behavior in cyberspace is expected. Like, we expect you to act that way. That's not like you get extra credit for it. And it's reinforced. Whereas irresponsible behavior is isolating and costly. Now, you think of how the world responded to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and it was isolating and costly. And what this is essentially saying is being a bad actor, state-sponsored bad actor in cyberspace should have real-world ramifications. That is really a different stance than has been in the past, where it's kind of been seen as, well, we can't attribute that behavior to that state, so we're not going to punish the state for these perceived infractions. And this is saying we will hold you responsible, and we will sanction you, and we will isolate you, and we will do some of the same things we've done to the Russian Federation for this kind of behavior. And Andy, I thought it was really interesting that you referenced the Geneva Convention, because, again, referencing our employer, Microsoft president and chief legal officer Brad Smith published a book called Tools and Weapons. And one of the things Brad has advocated for a long time now has been a digital Geneva Convention to go over rules of engagement for cyberspace, to set that standard of this is the expected behavior, and any behavior outside of what's drawn up here is unacceptable. It's an act of war at that point, or a war crime, depending on the circumstance. And so that's something I think we need as well. So you talk about forging these international partnerships to pursue shared goals. I think that's part of it too, is we need to really define what is acceptable behavior and what is not. And that's something Brad has advocated for a long time. And to be honest, I could see him running for politics someday. He's really an incredibly engaging personality. He kind of acts like a statesman or spokesperson for Microsoft. He's been, as Microsoft has gone through a lot of these antitrust hearings about Microsoft's proposed acquisition of Activision Blizzard, Brad Smith has been the one going and responding to like the European Commission and those sorts of bodies to argue our position. But he's really a very captivating speaker, and he's done a lot of talking on this exact subject.
And speaking of, Brad Smith, he normally does write pretty good responses and blogs. Microsoft did have a response to the national cybersecurity strategy. It wasn't written by Brad Smith, and I have to look up the gentleman here, Tom Burt, who is a corporate vice president of customer security and trust. I don't know if he reports to Brad Smith or not. I have to look, but he wrote the response here to the national cyber security strategy, and I thought it was a pretty good response. He, emphasizing collaboration. It's titled "Collaboration is Crucial to Strengthening Cybersecurity," and in there, he talks about how Microsoft has collaborated with federal partners quite a bit. Adam, you referenced the Digital Crimes Unit earlier, and that has been around since 2008.
Oh my gosh.
I'm part of an organization called InfraGard, where we work with the FBI, and what the FBI folks have told me is that we have an FBI agent assigned to Microsoft in the Digital Crimes Unit. There's a liaison that is specific. Their job is to liaise with just Microsoft. And so it's kind of cool to work for an organization that has that kind of pull on the national scale. And, we help out the federal government. So, I just wanted to include that, and there'll be a link to the response as well. But mainly, he's just agreeing that the strategy is great, and that Microsoft is going to definitely pitch in and help out with the private-public sector collaboration.
So I did look it up while you were talking. Tom Burt does, in fact, report to Brad Smith. So you nailed it.
There we go. That's what I thought. Like you said, I mean, Brad Smith normally does these things, and so when I saw this, I was like, I'm surprised that Brad didn't write this one himself, but turns out Tom is a direct report of Brad. So same organization.
Perfect.
Well, that's our show for this week. hopefully you guys get a chance to look over the National Cybersecurity Strategy. It's really good. I think it's a great holistic document, hits all the points. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you guys have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks and have a great night. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.